The boy was 4 years old and had never been to our house. I was certain of that. So when he picked up a crayon at the community center and drew our front door, the broken latch, the climbing rose, the window nobody could see from the street, I stopped breathing. My husband was standing right beside me. He didn't say a word. He just stared at that drawing like a man watching something he buried crawl back out of the ground. Who is this child? Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. I almost didn't go that Saturday. It was one of those mornings where getting dressed felt like too much to ask. Daniel had already left for a meeting, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee, looking at nothing. The kind of morning I'd been having a lot of lately. 2 years. 2 years of trying, of hoping, of telling myself next time. And then no next time. Just the same quiet kitchen. The same empty rooms upstairs. Volunteering at the community family day had been my therapist's idea. Get around children, she said. Not to replace anything. Just to feel useful. I didn't tell her how much I was dreading it. But I went. The community center smelled like craft glue and floor cleaner. There were kids everywhere, running, crying, laughing, the usual organized chaos. I was assigned to the craft table, which I thought would be the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part was the boy sitting alone at the end of the table. He was small, maybe 4 years old, with careful eyes that watched everything from a slight distance, like he'd learned early not to get too close to things. One of the staff members leaned over to me quietly. He's a foster placement. Emergency care. No family contact on file. She said it like an apology. I sat down near him and pushed some crayons in his direction. He didn't look up, but after a moment he picked up a brown one and started drawing. Most kids that age draw chaos. Big circles, wild colors, scribbles that mean everything and nothing. This boy drew with focus. His small hand moved in short, deliberate strokes. I watched, not really paying attention, talking to the other children nearby. Helping a little girl glue googly eyes onto a paper plate. Then I looked back at his page. And everything stopped. It was a house. 2 stories. A front door with a small detail on the right side, a broken latch, slightly off-center, that we'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. On the left pillar, climbing upward in careful crayon strokes, a rose. Not a cartoon rose. The shape of our rose, the way it spread along the brick. And in the upper left, a narrow window. A window that faced the side alley. A window you couldn't see from any street. A window that didn't exist in your line of sight unless you were inside the house, or standing in the backyard, or, I couldn't finish the thought. I sat very still. Then I asked him, as gently as I could, "That's a beautiful house. Where did you see it?" He didn't look up. He kept coloring. "From before," he said. Just that. From before. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. He picked up a green crayon and added more leaves to the rose. Like the conversation was already finished. I stared at the drawing until my eyes started making excuses for me. Lots of houses look like that. 2 stories, a front door, a climbing plant, it's not specific. But the window was specific. The broken latch was specific. And the way he'd drawn them, without hesitation, without looking up, from memory, made my hands go cold. I was still sitting there when I heard Daniel's voice behind me. He'd come to pick me up, like we'd planned. I heard him talking to someone near the entrance, easy and relaxed the way he always was with strangers. I turned to wave him over. He crossed the room and looked down at the table. At the drawing. I watched his face. I know my husband's face. I've watched it for 6 years. I know what he looks like when he's surprised, when he's pretending, when he's working hard at something inside. What I saw in that moment wasn't shock. It was something worse than shock. It was the expression of a man who already knew what he was looking at, and was deciding, in real time, in front of me, what to do about it. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by that easy, calm expression I'd always trusted. "Art class," he said, and almost smiled. "Daniel." I kept my voice low. "Look at it." He looked again. This time like it was nothing. "It's a house, Elena. Could be any house. Look at the window. Look at the latch." He glanced at the detail on the door and shook his head slowly. "Kids draw what they see on TV. Architecture shows, house tours, they pick things up." He put his hand on my shoulder. "Come on. Let's go." He picked up the drawing and dropped it into the waste bin near the door as we left. Casually. Like he was tidying up. I kept walking. I didn't say anything. We reached the car and I got in and looked out the window while Daniel talked about where to have dinner. His voice was normal. Relaxed. The voice of a man who had nothing on his mind. At a red light 2 blocks away, I said I'd forgotten my jacket. He offered to go back. I said I'd just run in, it would take 30 seconds. It took 15. I went straight to the bin, took the drawing, folded it once, and put it inside my jacket pocket. On the drive home I talked about dinner. I agreed with whatever he suggested. I laughed once at something he said. The drawing pressed flat against my ribs the whole way. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I went to our bedroom closet. I pushed past the coats at the back, found a safe place on the inner wall, and pinned the drawing there with a thumbtack. I stood looking at it for a while. Our house, drawn by a child who'd never been there. A child with no family on file. A child who said he knew it from before. I turned around. Daniel was standing in the doorway. He looked at me. At the closet. At my hands, now empty. Something moved across his face, not anger, not surprise, something I didn't have a name for. Then he turned around and walked back to bed without saying a single word. And I stood there in the dark, realizing that the most frightening thing wasn't the drawing. It was that my husband had looked at it, really looked at it, and said nothing at all. If this story is pulling you in, drop a comment below. What do you think the boy meant by from before? And if you want to find out what Elena discovers next, subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is only getting deeper. I told myself I wasn't going to look. I made breakfast the next morning, I smiled at Daniel across the table, I listened to him talk about his afternoon meetings. And I told myself the drawing was just a drawing. A coincidence. A child's imagination. But the whole time, I was thinking about the closet. And the whole time, Daniel didn't mention it once. We met 6 years ago at a work event, one of those industry dinners where nobody really wants to be there but everyone pretends otherwise. Daniel was already successful by then. Calm in a way that felt rare. While everyone else in the room was performing, he was just still. I fell for that stillness immediately. I mistook it for safety. For the first year we were together, I asked him almost nothing about his past. He wasn't secretive exactly, he'd answer questions, he just answered them in a way that left you feeling satisfied without actually learning much. He had a gift for that. I used to think it was emotional maturity. I understand now it's something different. After breakfast, I called my friend Petra. Petra had introduced us, technically. She'd known Daniel in passing before I did, through mutual work contacts. I'd never asked her much about that time. I called her now under the excuse of catching up, and after 10 minutes of small talk I let the question fall casually. Did Daniel ever talk to you about the woman he was with before me? A short pause. Sasha? She said the name like it was one she'd been careful not to bring up. A little, Petra said. Not much. It ended really fast, right before you two met. Like, suddenly fast. I always got the feeling it didn't end well, but he never said anything specific. Another pause. Why? Just thinking, I said. You know how you sometimes realize you don't know someone's full story? Petra laughed quietly. Elena, nobody knows Daniel's full story. That's just Daniel. She meant it warmly. It didn't land that way. After I hung up, I sat with the name. Sasha. I'd heard it exactly once before, early in our relationship, when I'd asked Daniel directly if there was anyone serious before me. He'd said yes, briefly, a woman named Sasha, and that it had ended because she wanted things he couldn't give. He said it the way you close a cupboard, firmly, without drama, in a way that made further questions feel unnecessary. I hadn't pushed. I'd been so relieved to have found someone steady that I'd accepted steady on his terms. I went to the storage room off our hallway. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I told myself I was reorganizing. 40 minutes later, at the back of a high shelf behind a box of old tax folders, I found a phone. It was Daniel's. I recognized the case, an old one he'd replaced years ago. The screen was badly cracked, spiderwebbed across the whole face. Dead? I pressed the power button twice. Nothing. I turned it over in my hands. People don't usually keep broken phones. They throw them away or leave them in a drawer by the door. They don't put them in a box, on a high shelf, behind tax records. I set it on the counter and kept looking at it. That evening I asked him. We were doing the dishes, which is when we always had the easiest conversations, side by side, not face to face. I kept my voice light. I was thinking about Sasha today, I said. I realized I barely know anything about that time. Daniel handed me a rinsed plate. What made you think about her? Just something Petra said. He nodded slowly. It ended because she wanted things I couldn't give her. Word for word. The exact same sentence from 6 years ago. What things? I asked. A different kind of life. He turned off the tap. She wanted someone who was completely open, all the time. I'm not built that way. She needed more than I had. He picked up a dish towel. It wasn't dramatic. It just ran out. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of honest, measured thing a mature person says about a past relationship. I thought about the phone on the high shelf. I said, that makes sense, and changed the subject. That night, Daniel fell asleep easily, the way he always did. I lay beside him listening to his breathing even out, and then I got up. I found my contact at social services, a woman I'd met through the volunteer program, someone I'd helped connect to a charitable grant 2 years ago. I texted her, apologized for the hour, and asked if she could look up a date of birth for a specific child in the emergency foster system. I gave her the boy's name from the community center intake form. I'd memorized it without meaning to. She texted back 20 minutes later with a single line. A date. I sat at the kitchen table and did the math 3 times because I didn't trust myself after the first 2. The boy was born 9 months after Daniel and Sasha ended. I sat with that number for a long time. I tried to build an innocent explanation around it. 9 months isn't specific, relationships overlap, timelines blur, coincidences happen. I knew that. I told myself that. But the drawing was still in my closet. A house the boy had never visited, drawn from memory, with details nobody could have guessed. And Daniel had looked at it and called it nothing. And the phone was on the high shelf behind the tax records. And Sasha had wanted things he couldn't give. I sat at that table until the kitchen got cold, turning the number over and over, trying to find the angle where it meant something else. I couldn't find it. I found Sasha on a Tuesday afternoon while Daniel was at work. It didn't take long. A name, a city, a rough time frame, social media did the rest. Within 20 minutes I had a profile, a face, and enough photographs to understand that whatever I'd been building in my head for the past 3 days was wrong. Sasha was happy. Not performing happy. Actually happy. Her profile was full of the ordinary evidence of a settled life, weekend markets, a sunlit apartment, a husband with his arm around her shoulder in every other photo. She was living abroad, visibly pregnant, glowing in the specific way of someone who has exactly what they wanted. I scrolled slowly, feeling something loosen in my chest. She had a son. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, gap-toothed and grinning in most photos. Clearly older than the child from the community center. The timelines didn't work at all. Whatever I'd calculated at the kitchen table at midnight, the 9 months, the dates, the silent arithmetic, none of it applied to this woman. I sat back and felt genuinely ashamed of myself. I had taken a child's drawing, a broken phone, and a number on a calendar, and turned a perfectly ordinary woman into something dark. I had been so ready to find a villain that I'd almost invented one. I almost closed the browser. Then I saw the tag. It was a photo from what looked like a birthday dinner, Sasha, her husband, a few friends around a table. Someone had tagged her husband by name. Mikhail Voss. I read it twice. Then I searched the name separately to make sure I hadn't misread it. Mikhail Voss. Sasha's husband. The man in the photo with his arm around her, laughing at something off camera. Voss was Daniel's last name. I sat very still. It could be a coincidence. Voss wasn't the rarest surname. But something about it made me open a new tab and search Mikhail Voss alongside Daniel's full name. The third result was an old industry article from about 12 years ago, a business profile of Daniel's company, early days. In the acknowledgement section at the bottom, a single line, special thanks to family supporters, including Mikhail Voss. Family. Daniel had a cousin named Mikhail, and he had never once mentioned him. That evening I set the table for dinner, poured 2 glasses of water, and waited until we were halfway through the meal. I came across a strange name today, I said, keeping my voice easy. Mikhail Voss. Do you know anyone by that name? Daniel's fork stopped. Not a pause. A stop. A full, complete stillness that lasted less than 2 seconds before he picked up the motion again and reached for his glass. Where did you hear that? His voice was level. Just online somewhere. Research for something. I shrugged. The last name caught my attention. He set the glass down. He's my cousin. We haven't spoken in over 10 years. There was a falling out, family things. Nothing worth explaining. He cut into his food. Why? Just curious. Voss isn't that common. It's common enough. He redirected to something about work, something about a project running over schedule, and within 60 seconds the conversation had moved on completely. I let it go. But I kept thinking about that fork. The way it had stopped midair like a small system failure before he caught it and kept going. Nothing worth explaining. Daniel had a cousin named Mikhail. Mikhail had married Sasha. And Daniel had never told me that the woman from his past had married into his own family. That wasn't an omission. That was a choice. After dinner I went to the closet. I took down the drawing and sat on the edge of the bed with it under the lamp, looking at it properly for the first time since I'd retrieved it from the bin. I'd been so focused on the house itself, the latch, the rose, the window, that I hadn't looked at the whole page. In the upper right corner, almost at the edge of the paper, the boy had drawn a figure. I'd noticed it before and dismissed it. A small stick figure in the upstairs window, the kind of detail a child adds without thinking to show that a house is lived in. Decorative. Automatic. But now I looked at it differently. The figure wasn't facing the street. Every child-drawn figure in a window faces outward. That's the whole point, someone looking out, someone visible, someone waving. That's what children draw because that's what makes sense to them. This figure faced inward. Into the room. Away from the glass. The boy hadn't drawn someone looking out at the world. He'd drawn someone standing inside the house, seen from behind. Which meant the boy hadn't imagined this figure the way you imagine something from the outside. He'd placed it the way you remember something from the inside. Standing in a room. Seen from a specific angle. An angle that only existed if you were already in the house. I put the drawing down on the bed and sat with that thought. Not from before like a story someone told him. From before like a place he remembered. He had been inside our house. He had stood in a room and watched someone standing at that window. And he had held that memory so carefully that 4 years later, at a craft table in a community center, he drew it exactly right. The question was no longer whether the drawing was real. The question was who was standing at that window, and whether they knew. I was only now beginning to find out. I found the security system by accident. I was looking for the router password, we'd had a technician coming and I needed to write it down, and I opened the wrong drawer in Daniel's home office. Inside was a small black panel with a label I didn't recognize. A brand name. A model number. And a handwritten login code on a sticker underneath. I stood there for a moment. Daniel had installed a home security camera system 2 years ago. I knew that. He'd mentioned it once as something the insurance company recommended. I'd said fine and never thought about it again. I had never once looked at the footage. I took the login code to my laptop. The archive went back 26 months. Exterior cameras only, the gate, the front door, the side path. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I told myself I was just checking. Just looking. I scrolled back to 18 months ago, roughly. No particular reason. Just a feeling. It took me about 20 minutes to find it. A Thursday afternoon. Elena was at work, I could verify that from my own calendar. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m. A woman appeared at the gate. The camera angle was poor, pointed slightly downward and to the left. All I could see was a dark coat, shoulder-length hair, one hand resting on the gate bar. No face. She stood completely still. She waited 11 minutes. At 2:58, the gate opened from the inside. Daniel let her in. They disappeared toward the front door, out of frame. And then, nothing. The next timestamp jumped to 4:01 p.m. 63 minutes of footage, completely gone. Not static, not corrupted. The file simply didn't exist. Someone had gone into the system and removed it. I sat looking at the gap in the archive for a long time. There is a difference between footage that fails and footage that is deleted. I understood the difference. And I understood what it meant that Daniel knew how to tell the difference too. I needed to be careful about how I asked. That evening I brought it up the way you bring up something minor, while I was doing something else, not looking at him directly. I mentioned that I'd noticed the security system and asked if he remembered having any visitors 18 months ago. Maintenance, deliveries, anything like that. Daniel thought about it. Or performed thinking about it. Nothing specific comes to mind, he said. Why? The archive has a gap. Probably a technical glitch. I shrugged. I just noticed it. He nodded slowly. Those systems drop footage sometimes. Storage limits. His expression was careful. Not confused, careful. There's a difference, and I'd been married to this man long enough to know it. Confused is open. Careful is managed. He changed the subject gently and I let him, and I spent the rest of the evening watching his hands and thinking about 11 minutes at a gate. The next morning I went back to the community center. I told myself it was a follow-up visit. I brought some donated art supplies as a reason to be there. The caseworker, a tired, kind woman named Rosa, met me in the hallway and we talked for a few minutes about the boy's adjustment, his routine, whether he was sleeping better. Then I asked her something I'd been holding for days. How long has he been in the system? Rosa checked her notes. Emergency placement was about 16 months ago. She paused. Before that, nothing on file. No prior placements, no family services contact, no record at all. He just appeared. 16 months ago. 2 months after the deleted footage. 2 months after a woman in a dark coat stood at my gate for 11 minutes and then walked into my house. I kept my voice steady. Does he ever talk about where he was before? Not really. He was very quiet when he first came in. Rosa looked at her folder. He used to repeat one word over and over when he was upset. A name. The staff noted it because it was the only personal information he volunteered for weeks. He stopped after a while, they usually do, once they settle. I felt something tighten across my chest. What name? Rosa looked at the file again, though I could tell she already remembered. Mikhail, she said. He kept saying Mikhail. I walked to my car and sat in the parking lot without starting the engine. Mikhail. Not Daniel. Not a mother's name, not a place, not a word for comfort. The name a small boy reached for when he was frightened and alone in a strange place, that name was Mikhail. Daniel's estranged cousin. Sasha's husband. The man Daniel had dismissed at dinner as nobody, with a fork that stopped mid-air. I tried to line it up in a way that made sense. Maybe Mikhail had been involved in the boy's care before the placement. Maybe he was a family friend of the mother's. Maybe the boy had simply heard the name somewhere and attached to it the way young children sometimes attach to sounds. I tried. I genuinely tried. But I kept coming back to the woman at the gate. The deleted hour. The fact that 2 months after she walked into my house, a boy with no history appeared in the city's emergency care system, a boy who could draw my home from memory, who knew a window that couldn't be seen from the street, who said Mikhail when he was scared. Someone had been inside my house. Someone had brought that child into my life before I ever knew he existed. And the name he cried at night wasn't my husband's. Which meant either Daniel was protecting Mikhail, or there was something connecting all of them that I still didn't have the shape of yet. I started the car. I needed to find out who Mikhail Voss actually was. I gave Daniel one more day. I told myself it was patience. Really it was fear of what a direct confrontation would cost us, fear of what his face would do when I put everything on the table at once. But by Thursday evening I couldn't hold it anymore. The deleted footage. The name Rosa had read from her file. The timeline that kept folding back on itself no matter how I tried to straighten it. I waited until after dinner. Until the house was quiet and there was nowhere comfortable to retreat to. I need you to tell me about Mikhail, I said. All of it. Not the dinner version. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in him, not defensiveness, something heavier than that. He set down his glass and said, "Sit down." He talked for a long time. Mikhail had come to him in crisis about 18 months ago, just as the deleted footage had shown. He was in serious trouble, legal problems Elena didn't need the details of, financial collapse that had happened fast and badly. And there was a child. A small boy, not yet 3, whose mother had disappeared, not gradually, not ambiguously. She had simply left. No note, no forwarding address, no contact. Mikhail couldn't raise the boy alone. Not in the state he was in. He came to Daniel because Daniel was the only family he trusted, and he asked for help placing the child quietly, outside the official system, at least temporarily, while Mikhail tried to stabilize. Daniel had arranged it. Unofficial channels, a temporary care situation. When that placement fell through after a few months, the boy had ended up in emergency foster care, which is how Rosa's file began. He hadn't told Elena because it was October. Because Elena had been barely functional in October, held together by medication and careful routines after their 3rd failed attempt. Because he had looked at his wife and decided she could not carry one more hard thing. He said it plainly, without drama. I was trying to protect you. Not as an excuse. Almost as a confession. I sat across from him and felt something release in my chest. It fit. All of it. The drawing, the boy had been briefly in our home, that's how he knew it. The deleted footage, Daniel protecting a secret that wasn't his to share. The name Mikhail, repeated in the dark by a frightened child, because Mikhail was his father, the last family he remembered. Daniel wasn't hiding guilt. He was hiding loyalty. Protecting a cousin who had nowhere else to turn, and a wife who was already at her limit. I started crying before I meant to. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way you cry when something you've been braced for turns out not to be the thing you feared. He came around the table and held me, and I let him, and for the first time in 2 weeks I felt the ground come back under my feet. I told him I forgave him for keeping it from me. I meant it completely. That night I slept without the drawing on my mind for the first time since the community center. 3 days later, everything came apart again. It happened through a coincidence so ordinary it almost didn't register at first. A mutual contact, a woman I knew through a charity board, mentioned she'd recently been in touch with Sasha. With Mikhail's wife. I asked how they were doing. The woman smiled. Better now. It was such a hard year for them. Did you hear about the accident? Mikhail was in a coma for 8 months. Sasha was incredible, honestly, she basically held everything together alone. I kept my expression even. I didn't know it was that serious. Oh, it was terrible. He doesn't remember almost any of it. The whole middle stretch of that year is just gone for him. I asked, carefully, when the accident had happened. She gave me a date. I did the math in the car on the way home, sitting in a parking structure with the engine off. 8 months in a coma. Starting from a date that placed Mikhail completely, medically, impossibly absent during the window when the boy must have been conceived. Mikhail could not be this child's father. Which meant Daniel's explanation, all of it, the crisis, the legal trouble, the vanished mother, the placement arranged out of family loyalty, was built on a foundation that didn't exist. Not a lie about small details. A lie about the only detail that mattered. I sat there until the parking structure lights flickered on around me. I thought about the way Daniel had looked when he finally told me. The weight in his voice. The way he'd come around the table when I cried, how solid his arms had felt. I had believed him because he'd seemed to be telling me something that cost him something. That's how you know a confession is real, I'd always thought. It hurts the person saying it. But a skilled enough lie costs something too. That's what makes it convincing. 3 days ago I had forgiven my husband. I hadn't known yet what I was actually forgiving him for. I started the engine. I drove home. And the whole way, one question moved through me like cold water. If Mikhail wasn't the boy's father, then who was Daniel actually protecting? If this story is pulling at something in you, drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Daniel is really hiding? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when the next chapter drops. This one goes much deeper. I didn't tell Daniel I was searching the house. I waited until he left for work on Monday morning, and then I started at the top and worked my way down. Not frantically, methodically. The way you search when you already know something is there and you're just deciding whether you're ready to find it. The attic first. We barely used it. Daniel's boxes from his previous apartment had sat up there for years, unopened, because there was never a good reason to go through them, and I'd always respected that boundary without thinking too much about why. I was done respecting boundaries. Most of the boxes were ordinary. Books, old files, cables for devices that no longer existed. I worked through them steadily, replacing lids, moving on. Then, near the back wall, partly hidden behind a broken lamp we'd kept meaning to throw away, a box that felt different. Not sealed the way the others were. The flaps just folded closed. Inside, a child's jacket. Small. The size for a 2 or 3 year old. Dark blue, slightly worn at the elbows, the kind of jacket that had been worn regularly, not occasionally. No tag, it had been removed, or had fallen off long ago. I held it for a moment. It was light and very small in my hands. I checked the pockets. In the left one, a torn photograph. Roughly half of it, ripped vertically. A woman's face, but only half. Dark hair, one eye, the edge of a smile. The other half was gone. Whoever had torn this had kept one piece and left the other here, or lost it, or hidden it deliberately. I didn't recognize her. I set both items on the attic floor and sat with them in the quiet. On my way out of the attic I remembered the phone. I'd left it on the shelf in the storage room weeks ago after the screen refused to respond. I'd told myself there was nothing on it. I believed that because it was easier. I took it to a repair shop that afternoon, a small place downtown, not the kind with a corporate logo. The technician, a young man who barely looked up from his workbench, said he'd try a direct data recovery before the internal storage gave out completely. He called me back in 40 minutes. Most of it's gone, he said. But I got one thing before it crashed. A contacts entry. You want it? He handed me a printed screenshot. One name. A woman's name I had never heard, not Sasha, not anyone Daniel had ever mentioned. And below the name, in the notes field of the contact entry, a single handwritten style line. Don't call after 9. He sleeps light. I read it 3 times in the car. He sleeps light. A note about a child's sleep schedule. Written by someone who knew the child's routines well enough to leave a reminder about them. Written in the kind of shorthand you use when you're trying not to forget something important, something practical, something that matters on a daily basis. Daniel had saved this contact. Daniel had known this woman. And this woman had a child whose sleep he needed to be careful not to disturb. I drove to the community center. I hadn't planned to bring the jacket. At the last minute, before I got out of the car, I took it from the back seat and folded it over my arm. The boy was in the play area when I arrived. Rosa let me sit with him without much explanation. I'd become a familiar enough face by now that my visits didn't require detailed reasons. He was building something with wooden blocks, focused and quiet the way he always was. I sat on the floor nearby and said hello. He glanced at me and went back to his blocks. I waited a few minutes. Then I set the jacket on the floor between us, casually, like I'd just set down my bag. He saw it immediately. He stopped building. He looked at it the way children look at something that belongs to them, not with excitement, but with a kind of certain recognition, the way you recognize your own handwriting. He reached over and picked it up. Put it on without being asked. It still fit, just barely. He smoothed the front with both hands. Mine, he said quietly. Not that looks like mine. Not I had one like this. Just, mine. Present tense. Absolute. I kept my voice soft. Who gave it to you? He thought about it seriously, the way small children think when they're trying to retrieve something real rather than invent something pleasing. The man with the sad face, he said. I waited. He didn't add anything. He went back to his blocks, still wearing the jacket. I had brought a photograph. I'd printed it that morning from Daniel's company website, a group photo from a corporate event 3 years ago. 8 men standing in a loose row, including Daniel, near the center. I set it on the floor where he could see it. Do you know anyone in this picture? He leaned forward and studied it with that same careful, unhurried attention he gave everything. Then he pointed. His small finger landed without hesitation on a face in the back row. A man I recognized, not well, but enough. I'd seen him once, maybe twice, at company events years ago. Daniel's former business partner. A man named Gregor, who had left the company under circumstances Daniel had described, briefly, as creative differences. The boy's finger stayed on Gregor's face. Not Daniel. Not anyone connected to Mikhail. A man I'd barely registered as part of this story at all. The man with the sad face. I looked at Gregor's expression in the photograph. And now that the boy had named it, I could see it, something in the set of his mouth, the way his eyes didn't quite match the occasion. Not unhappy exactly. Waited. Like a man carrying something he couldn't put down. I drove home trying to understand how Gregor fit into any of this. Trying to understand what a former business partner had to do with a small boy, a torn photograph, a jacket hidden in an attic box. And underneath all of that, one quieter question that I couldn't shake. If Daniel hadn't given the boy the jacket, why did the jacket end up in Daniel's boxes? Finding Gregor took less than a day. Professional records, an old LinkedIn profile, a business registration that still had a contact email. I wrote to him that same evening, short, careful, giving nothing away. I said I was a former colleague of Daniel's reaching out about a personal matter. I said it was important. He replied within 2 hours. He said he could meet Thursday. He named a coffee shop across town, not close to either of our neighborhoods. The kind of place you choose when you don't want to be seen by anyone you know. I didn't tell Daniel. Gregor was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall and a coffee he hadn't touched. He was a compact, careful-looking man, the kind who watches doorways. When I sat down across from him, the first thing he said wasn't hello. Did Daniel send you? No, I said. Daniel doesn't know I'm here. He looked at me for a long moment, deciding something. Then some of the tension in his shoulders released, just slightly. I wondered when someone would come, he said. I just didn't think it would be you. I put the company photo on the table between us. The boy's finger had landed on Gregor's face without hesitation. I told him that. I told him about the community center, the drawing, the jacket. I watched his expression as I talked, and what I saw there wasn't surprise. It was relief. The complicated kind, the kind that comes when something you've been carrying alone finally has somewhere to go. Daniel didn't have an affair, Gregor said. He said it carefully, like he understood that was the theory I'd been living with. Then what did he do? He knew. Gregor wrapped both hands around his cup. He knew from the beginning. And he made a choice to protect someone, but it wasn't himself. And it wasn't Mikhail. The name landed between us. There's a woman named Vera, he said. She worked at the company, not senior level, back office. Smart. Quiet. She came to Daniel about 2 years ago because she was frightened and she had nowhere else to go. He paused. She had a son. A small boy. And the boy's father was someone who had enough power to make both of them disappear if he decided to. I kept my voice flat. Disappear how? Gregor looked at the table. Take the child through legal channels she couldn't fight. Pay her enough to go away quietly. Or make things difficult enough that she went anyway. He looked up. She came to Daniel because she'd heard he was someone who didn't bend to that kind of pressure. She needed someone to help her stay hidden long enough to build a legal case. I thought about the deleted footage. The woman in the dark coat at my gate. 11 minutes of waiting before Daniel opened it. He hid her, I said. For a while. Yes. In our house. Gregor didn't answer immediately. Which was its own answer. And the boy, I said. He was here too. Elena. Gregor leaned forward slightly. Daniel did this because someone had to. Because Vera was genuinely afraid and the person she was afraid of had resources she couldn't match alone. Who? I asked. Who was she afraid of? Gregor sat back. Something closed in his face, not coldness, more like a door reaching the end of its frame. I've already said more than I should, he said quietly. I promised Daniel I'd stay out of it. I've broken that enough for one day. He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. Ask Daniel who Vera was afraid of. Ask him directly. He'll tell you now. I think he's been waiting for you to ask the right question for weeks. He was gone before I could form the next sentence. I sat at that corner table for a long time after he left. Everything I'd built in my head over the past weeks was shifting, not collapsing, shifting. The shape of it was changing into something I didn't have words for yet. Daniel hadn't betrayed me with Sasha. Mikhail hadn't fathered the boy. The story wasn't about infidelity or family loyalty or a man hiding his own guilt. It was about a woman named Vera who had been afraid of someone powerful enough to make Daniel, calm, contained, careful Daniel, open his gate and delete an hour of footage and hide a child in our attic. Someone was behind all of this. Not Daniel. Someone Daniel was protecting people from. And I still didn't know who. I drove home slowly. Daniel's car was in the driveway when I pulled in. I sat in my own car for a moment, looking at the house, our house, the one the boy had drawn from memory, the one with the climbing rose and the broken latch and the narrow side window. I looked up at that window now. Daniel was standing there. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing at the glass, looking out, exactly the way someone looks when they've been waiting and don't know how to stop. And then it happened, quietly, without drama, like a key finally finding its lock. I thought about the drawing. The figure in the upstairs window, facing away from the street. I had decided, weeks ago, that the boy drew the figure from outside, that he'd imagined it, or seen it from the garden. I'd built a whole theory around that. But children draw what they remember. And you can only see someone standing at that window from the inside, from a specific angle, in a specific room, looking across toward the glass. The boy hadn't imagined that figure. He had stood in our house and watched someone standing at that window. He had been inside these walls, in these rooms, close enough to notice how someone stood when they thought no one was watching. He hadn't just known about our house. He had lived here. Even briefly. Even secretly. He had been here, brought here, hidden here, by a man who believed he was doing the right thing and had never once found the right moment to tell his wife. Daniel turned from the window. He must have seen my car. I got out and walked to the front door and I thought about Gregor's last words. Ask him who Vera was afraid of. Tonight, in that house where a child had once slept in a room I didn't know about, I was going to ask my husband the question that should have been the first one. If this story is reaching something in you, tell us in the comments, did you see this coming, or did it catch you off guard? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next chapter is where the truth finally has a name. Daniel was waiting for me. Not in the living room, not in the kitchen, in the hallway, just inside the front door, like he'd heard my car pull in and walked there and stayed. When I came through the door he looked at me the way someone looks when they've made a decision and are done waiting to act on it. He said, I know you met with Gregor. I didn't apologize. Then you know what he told me. Some of it. He stepped back. Come and sit down. There's something I need you to try to remember. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my midnight arithmetic weeks ago, the same chairs, the same two people, and yet nothing about it felt the same. Daniel didn't reach for my hand. He didn't try to soften what was coming. He just looked at me and said, I need you to go back to October. 2 years ago. October 2 years ago. I felt the shape of it before I could fill it in. A blurred month. 6 weeks that existed in my memory as a series of disconnected images, the bedroom ceiling, a glass of water on the nightstand, Daniel's voice from somewhere nearby, always nearby. Our third failed attempt had broken something in me that the first two hadn't quite reached. The doctor had used the word breakdown with clinical gentleness. The medication had worked, eventually. I'd come back to myself slowly, the way daylight comes back in winter, so gradually you almost don't notice until one morning you simply are again. I had never examined that period too closely. It hurt in a specific way that felt better left alone. What about October? I asked. Vera came to me in September, Daniel said. She'd been an employee, back office, contracts. She came to me because she was frightened and she'd run out of options. He paused. She had a son. Just under 2 years old. And the boy's father had told her, clearly, that he intended to take the child through legal channels she couldn't afford to fight, and that if she made trouble, he had the resources to make her life very small. I watched his face. He wasn't managing his expression the way he usually did. Whatever containment he normally maintained, he'd set it down somewhere. She asked me to help her disappear for a while, he said. Long enough to build a legal case. Long enough to be safe. He looked at the table. I said yes. You brought her here. I brought her here. The attic room. The jacket in the box. The figure in the window that the boy had drawn facing inward, because he had stood in our house and watched someone stand there. Daniel. My voice came out quieter than I intended. I was here. I was in this house. You were barely here. He said it without cruelty, just as a fact. Elena, in October you were not able to hold much. You were sleeping 12 hours and still exhausted. You were on medication that made the edges soft. He met my eyes. I want to be honest with you about that because I'm not going to use it as an excuse. But I need you to understand what I was looking at. My wife couldn't get out of bed most mornings, and a woman with a small child was sleeping in our attic because I had told her she would be safe there. The room was very quiet. I tried to locate October in my body, to find the weeks I'd lost to that gray softness, and I understood, for the first time, that I had been in this house with a child I didn't know existed. That somewhere above my head, a small boy had slept light, the way children do in unfamiliar places, while I slept through everything below. Vera begged me not to tell you, Daniel said. Not because she didn't trust you. Because every person who knew was a risk. The boy's father had money and patience. Vera needed the location to be absolutely protected. He looked at his hands. And I looked at you in October and I made the decision that you were not going to carry this on top of everything else. Maybe I was wrong. But that's what I decided. How long were they here? 6 weeks. When you started to stabilize, when I could see you coming back, I found a more permanent arrangement. Vera left with the boy. She placed him in emergency care a few months later when the legal situation became too dangerous for her to stay in the country. She planned to return. He paused. She hasn't. I thought about the boy at the craft table. The way he'd drawn our house without hesitation. The way he'd said from before like it was a place that lived in him, warm and certain, the way safe places do. He had been happy here. A 2-year-old boy in an attic room, hidden from someone who wanted to take him, and he had been happy enough to carry the memory for 2 years and put it on paper the moment someone gave him a crayon. Something in my chest collapsed slowly, like a structure that had been load-bearing for a long time. Why didn't you tell me afterward? I asked. When I was better? Why not then? Because Vera was still hiding. Because telling you meant the secret got larger. And because, he stopped. Started again. Because I had watched you in October and I knew how much you wanted a child. And I had hidden one in our house for 6 weeks. I didn't know how to hand you that. The silence between us was different now. Not the silence of secrets. Something older and sadder. I sat with all of it, the jacket, the deleted footage, the drawing. Every week I'd spent building a story about betrayal and infidelity and a husband I didn't know. And underneath all of that, the actual thing, a man who had looked at his broken wife and a frightened woman and a small boy and had tried, imperfectly and without asking permission, to hold all of it at once. He hadn't failed me. He had failed to tell me. Those were not the same thing. But there was still one question left. The one I had been circling for weeks without knowing it was the center. Who is the boy's father? I asked. Who was Vera afraid of? Daniel looked at me across the table. For a long moment he said nothing. I could see him choosing, not whether to tell me, but how to prepare me for what the answer would do. Then he said, quietly and without looking away. You've met him. You just didn't know who you were looking at. If this chapter hit you somewhere deep, you're not alone. Tell us in the comments what you felt when the truth came out. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the final chapters of this story will change everything you thought you understood from the beginning. Daniel told me the name and I heard it the way you hear something in a dream, recognizable, impossible, and somehow already known. Tomas. My brother. I made Daniel say it again, not because I hadn't heard it, but because I needed the word to exist twice before I could let it be real. He said it again, quietly, and watched my face with the careful stillness of someone who has been holding a heavy thing for a long time and is finally, carefully, setting it down. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything. I just sat at that kitchen table and felt the entire architecture of the past 2 years rearrange itself around a name I should have thought of first. Tomas was 4 years older than me and had been at the edge of my life for most of it, present enough to matter, distant enough to stay mysterious. He'd built money through businesses I'd never fully understood, through connections he described vaguely and I'd never pressed on. Our parents had called him driven. I had called him unreachable. We'd settled into a version of sibling relationship that was warm on surfaces and hollow underneath. He'd attended our housewarming 6 years ago. He'd walked through every room, complimented the climbing rose, stood at the upstairs window and said something about the view. He'd charmed Daniel in the easy way he charmed everyone, and then he'd drifted back to his own life and we'd seen him maybe 3 times since. Vera had been his assistant. Daniel told me the rest of it in the same quiet, factual way, not as a story, more like the careful reading of a document. Vera and Tomas. Hidden. When she became pregnant, Tomas offered money first, then made it clear that the money was not optional. When Vera refused, the offer became a threat, legal, financial, structured by people who knew how to make threats look like paperwork. He wanted the child. He did not want Vera. She ran. She came to Daniel because someone had told her Daniel was the kind of man who didn't bend to that kind of pressure. They were right. I sat with it for a long time after Daniel finished talking. Then I went upstairs alone. The attic room was small and plain, a cot frame, a bare bulb, a wardrobe we'd kept meaning to clear out. I stood in the middle of it and tried to make the space match the story. A woman and a small boy. 6 weeks. A child who slept light in an unfamiliar place while Daniel brought food and I slept medicated 2 floors below. I moved the wardrobe. Behind it, low on the wall, almost at floor level, where a small hand could reach, a handprint. Child-sized. Made in blue paint, deliberate and careful, pressed flat against the plaster like a signature. Like proof of having been somewhere. Like a child's way of saying, I was here. This was real. I existed in this place. I crouched down and looked at it for a long time. And something shifted, not gently, but completely, the way a lens shifts when it finally finds focus. The drawing. I had spent weeks assuming the boy had been inside our house. I had built entire theories on that assumption. The figure in the window facing inward. The details no one could know from the outside. I had been so certain he had stood in these rooms. But he hadn't drawn the house from memory of being here. He had drawn it from the description of being here. Tomas had stood at our upstairs window 6 years ago and looked at the view. Tomas had walked through every room and stored what he saw. And at some point, before Vera ran, before everything collapsed, Tomas had described this house to his son in the way parents describe safe places to small children. There's a house with a rose on the front, and a window at the top, and a broken latch on the door. The way you describe somewhere you want a child to believe exists. Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe. The boy had never been here. He had held the story of this house the way children hold on to stories they need, tight, exact, detailed, because the detail makes it real. And then at a craft table in a community center, handed a crayon, he had drawn the safest place he knew. Which meant every piece of evidence I had used to build my case against Daniel, the details, the precision, the impossible knowledge, none of it was what I thought it was. It was a child's faith in a description. It was a small boy drawing somewhere he'd been told he could go if he ever needed to. I went back down and sat in the kitchen. Daniel was still there, waiting. I thought about every moment I'd aimed suspicion at him over the past weeks. Every careful question. Every dinner where I'd watched his fork midair. Every night I'd lain beside him calculating dates and building theories and measuring his silences for guilt. He had never lied to me. He had hidden things, yes. He had made decisions without me, yes. He had kept a secret in this house while I was too broken to know about it. All of that was real. But the man I had quietly been building in my head, the man with a hidden child, a buried affair, a double life, that man had never existed. What existed instead was a person who looked at a frightened woman and a small boy and a wife who was barely holding on, and tried to carry all of it without dropping any of it. Imperfectly. Silently. In the particular way of people who believe that love means absorbing damage so others don't have to. He had been protecting me from my own brother. I picked up my phone. I found Tomas in my contacts and I called him, and he answered on the first ring, not quickly, but immediately, like a man who had been sitting somewhere with his phone in his hand, waiting. Elena. His voice was smooth. Familiar. Completely calm. Tomas, I said. A brief silence. Then, I was wondering when Daniel would finally break. Not surprised. Not defensive. Not afraid. Just ready. The voice of someone who had already prepared for this conversation, who had already decided how it would go. And in that single sentence, in the casual certainty of it, I understood for the first time exactly who my brother was. And exactly what he had been willing to do to a woman and a small boy to protect what he considered his. Drop a comment below if this chapter hit you differently than you expected, because this story isn't about what it looked like at the start. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The final chapter is coming, and after everything Elena has learned, what happens next will stay with you. I didn't call Tomas back. He'd said what he said. I was wondering when Daniel would finally break, and I had ended the call without responding. Not out of shock. Out of clarity. Because the moment I heard his voice, that smooth and waiting calm, I understood that anything I said to him emotionally would become a resource he'd use. My brother had spent his entire life knowing how to turn other people's feelings into leverage. I was not going to give him mine. I went back downstairs. I sat across from Daniel. And I said, "Tell me what you have." He looked at me for a moment. Then he got up and went to his office. He came back with a folder. Not thin. 2 years of quiet, careful work. Copies of Tomas's original messages to Vera, the offers, then the threats, documented and dated. Records of the unofficial care arrangement Daniel had set up and then the emergency placement, with timestamps that built a clear timeline. Vera's own written account, notarized, stored with Daniel's lawyer at a firm Tomas had no connection to. And the legal filing Tomas had recently initiated, his formal claim for custody of the boy, routed through channels that assumed no one was ready for him. Daniel had been ready for 2 years. He hadn't confronted Tomas. He hadn't warned him off. He had simply built a file, piece by piece, and waited for the moment when it would matter most. You knew he'd make a move eventually, I said. I knew he wouldn't leave it alone. Men like Tomas don't. He set the folder on the table between us. I just needed enough time to make sure that when he did, there was something solid enough to stop him. I looked at the folder. 2 years of silence. 2 years of carrying this alone, in this house, next to me. You should have told me, I said. Yes, he said. I should have. No excuses. Just yes. The kind of yes that cost something. We met with the lawyer the following morning. The file was submitted before noon. Tomas's legal claim collapsed within the week. Not dramatically, paperwork rarely collapses dramatically. It fell apart the way structures fail when the foundation is removed, quietly, then completely. The documentation Daniel had built didn't just counter Tomas's filing. It exposed the pattern beneath it, the pressure campaign against Vera, the financial threats, the calculated attempt to use legal machinery to take a child from a mother who had fled to protect him. Tomas's credibility, in those proceedings and beyond, fractured in ways that couldn't be repaired with money or charm. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than that. The feeling of watching a door close on something that should have been closed long ago. Vera surfaced 4 days later. She called Daniel first, which I understood. He was the one who had held the ground while she'd been gone. She'd trusted him completely and he had not moved, not once, not under pressure, not under the weight of his own marriage straining at the edges. He had stood exactly where he'd said he would stand. She came to the house the following afternoon. I had thought about this moment and decided not to prepare for it, not to plan what I would say or how I would arrange my face. She knocked and I opened the door and we looked at each other across the threshold. She was younger than I'd imagined. Tired in a way that went past the surface, the tiredness of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was only now, carefully, beginning to stop. She had the torn half of a photograph in her jacket pocket. I saw the edge of it. I recognized it immediately. The other half was still in my closet, pinned above a drawing. We didn't hug. We didn't perform warmth we hadn't earned yet. We just looked at each other across something large and real, and I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where everything had begun and ended, and after a moment she said, quietly, "He told me you were strong enough. I believed him before you did." I didn't answer immediately. I thought about October. About 6 weeks of a bedroom ceiling and Daniel's voice from somewhere nearby. About how strong enough had looked from the inside of that particular darkness. He was more confident than he should have been, I said. Something in her face softened. Maybe, she said. But he wasn't wrong. I went to the community center one last time the following week. Vera was there with the boy, working through the paperwork for a stable long-term placement. I saw them through the window before I went in, the boy sitting close to her, not clinging, just close, the way children sit near things they've been afraid of losing. He saw me when I came through the door. He ran the way small children run, completely, with his whole body, without any of the caution adults carry. He stopped just in front of me and held something out. A drawing. Folded once, slightly crumpled at the edges from being held too long. I opened it. He had drawn a garden. A climbing rose on the left side, the shape of it recognizable even in crayon, the way it spread along something vertical, reaching upward. And standing next to it, a figure. A woman. My height, roughly. My hair, approximately. My face, completely wrong in the specific way children draw faces, the features too large, the proportions impossible, but my posture exactly right. Shoulders level. Head forward. Looking out, not back. He had drawn me the way he imagined me. Not from memory. From something else. I crouched down to his level. Is that me? He nodded seriously. It's very good, I said. He thought about this. Then, you were in the garden. I saw you from inside. I looked at him, this small boy who had carried a story about a safe place through 2 years of uncertain rooms and unfamiliar faces, who had drawn our house from a description and made it real in his mind through sheer need. Yes, I said. I was. I have both drawings now. They live in the same closet where the first one hung for weeks while I tried to understand what it meant. I take them out sometimes and look at them together, the house he remembered from a story, and the woman he drew from a window. A child who had nothing held on to a description of somewhere safe. He held it so carefully, so exactly, that he could put it on paper years later without hesitation. And the safe place, improbably, through everything, held. So did we. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the things we carry silently for the people we love, share what you felt in the comments. And if you're new here and you want more stories like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we tell is about real human things. We'll see you in the next one.